Auron MacIntyre opens the podcast with a critical appraisal of America's complex relationship with Israel, particularly highlighting how past U.S. administrations, including the Trump era, have grappled with the ramifications of an unbreakable alliance with a foreign nation. He underscores that while there may be some overlapping interests, such tightly bound relationships risk dragging American foreign policy into conflicts that ultimately harm U.S. national interests. The humanitarian horrors unfolding in the Middle East, such as the forced displacement of Palestinian populations, are cited as inevitable outcomes of deep-rooted ethnic incompatibility, a painful historical reality that America cannot afford to be complicit in. He elaborates that historically, many nations have resolved such entrenched ethnic conflicts through violent means, including forced migrations and ethnic cleansing. While morally repugnant, this brutal pattern repeatedly manifests throughout history. MacIntyre raises the critical question of why the United States should entangle itself in these protracted disputes when involvement serves neither its security nor moral framework. His perspective challenges mainstream American interventionist policies and suggests a need for reconsideration of U.S. engagement abroad. Diving deeper into American history, MacIntyre reflects on the foreign policy principles espoused by the Founding Fathers, particularly George Washington's farewell address. He reminds listeners that Washington explicitly cautioned against forming enduring foreign alliances, emphasizing that such attachments inevitably compromise a nation's sovereignty and invite foreign influence that can be fatal for Republican governance. This foundational wisdom contrasts starkly with America's contemporary foreign policy posture, which frequently embraces deep alliances that conflate U.S. interests with those of other nations. According to MacIntyre, Washington foresaw the internal political factionalism that would arise as politicians vie for favor with favored foreign nations, creating divisions that undermine national unity. He laments how this historical understanding has been excised from modern educational curricula, resulting in a populace and political class unmoored from the original intent of America's governance structure. The failure to heed such foundational advice has led to entanglements like Ukraine and Israel, where national interests become obscured by ideological and factional allegiances. The discussion then turns to the profound transformations in American identity as the post-Cold War ideological global framework dissolved. MacIntyre observes how the earlier clash of capitalism versus communism gave way to a deep inward focus on national identity, an area fraught with confusion and fragmentation. He argues that the predominant modern narrative around multiculturalism is flawed by a failure to understand that society is inherently a singular culture. Thus, a multicultural society is a self-contradictory concept. The forced erasure of distinct ethnic and cultural identities under a racialized and homogenized rubric leads to social confusion and undermines national cohesion. MacIntyre distinguishes between race as a broad, often reductive category and ethnos, a more precise, culturally and historically grounded identity. He explains that in America's past, even groups that faced oppression, such as Black Americans, forged an ethnos, while European-descended Americans maintained distinct subgroups aligned to their heritage. This granular understanding of ethnic identity stands in stark opposition to contemporary racial politics, which seek to flatten complex traditions into simplistic categories that serve managerial state interests. The loss of authentic cultural diversity is seen as part of a broader strategy to weaken communal resilience and individual autonomy. One of the most penetrating analyses offered in the podcast concerns the rise of a sprawling managerial elite that governs modern states and societies. MacIntyre outlines how historically governments, while sometimes selfish, typically maintained a balance by providing services such as security and infrastructure. However, he observes that contemporary bureaucracies predominantly serve their own perpetuation rather than the public's interest. These managerial classes, embedded across government, media, education, and finance, prioritize expanding their power and controlling populations through increasingly impersonal and mechanized means. He highlights the paradox where such bureaucracies exist ostensibly to serve, but in reality become self-contained entities focused on maintaining their relevance and resource flow. The growth of administrative personnel in areas like public education far outstrips frontline service providers, illustrating the drift towards self-serving structures. MacIntyre warns that this detachment from the governed creates systemic inefficiencies, erosion of public trust, and ultimately threatens society's functional stability, since the bureaucratic apparatus no longer aligns with the citizenry's needs. Returning to foundational American political thought, MacIntyre underscores the fragility of self-governance inherent in the Republican model, which requires active civic virtue and participation. He explains that as the United States has imperialized and expanded into a mass democracy, the scale of governance exceeded what Republican governance can sustain. In this larger complex system, power centralizes in vast bureaucratic states, and the constitutional checks embodied in the legislative branch wane in effectiveness. He paints a sobering picture of how the original Republican ideal, rooted in armed, virtuous citizens actively involved in self-defense and governance, has eroded. The transition from militias to professional armed forces, along with the overwhelming growth of the administrative state, means that governance is increasingly disconnected from the populace. This shift precipitates a form of oligarchy where powerful elites govern through technocracy and media manipulation, rather than democratic or Republican engagement. MacIntyre employs the haunting metaphor of the Native American ghost dance to illustrate modern democracy's declining power. Just as the ghost dance was a ritual of desperate hope that failed to restore Native American sovereignty and instead led to massacre, modern democratic rituals have become hollow ceremonies detached from actual political power and legitimacy. As citizens participate in elections and political processes, they effectively perform symbolic acts that no longer guarantee real governance or change, leading to widespread political disillusionment. He discusses how this disconnect is visible in the dysfunction of contemporary electoral politics, where elites block substantive reform and democratic institutions are hollowed out by both internal resistance and external managerial control. The continuing facade of democracy masks a systemic erosion of citizen agency, rendering democratic participation akin to a powerless ritual divorced from meaningful influence. The conversation shifts to the fundamental systemic challenge of scale in governing a vast global empire, such as the United States. MacIntyre explains that the complexity of managing extensive territories and populations demands a technocratic apparatus that inherently limits the applicability of Republican virtues. As societies scale up, control gravitates towards centralized authorities that require new methods of governance, including sophisticated surveillance and algorithmic regulation. He posits that these dynamics usher societies towards soft totalitarian models akin to contemporary China, where large populations are governed less by direct popular engagement and more by technological monitoring, social credit systems, and bureaucratic control. While acknowledging the pervasive resistance to openly adopting such regimes in the West, MacIntyre warns that these patterns are emerging covertly through practices like shadow banning, economic ostracism, and pervasive social control without overt coercion. A critical paradox MacIntyre discusses is why ruling elites deliberately maintain social chaos, division, and factional conflict despite controlling extensive surveillance and enforcement apparatuses. He suggests the purposeful generation of societal disorder prevents the formation of unified communities capable of challenging centralized authority. Chaos dilutes power across competing factions, rendering coordinated resistance difficult or impossible. This strategy, serving to perpetuate elite dominance, relies on fostering antagonistic identity politics and economic disparities. While technological control is growing, entrenched governance interests find value in maintaining societal friction, as excessive order could foster cohesive opposition and undermine elite hegemony. Chaos thus becomes a tool for managing power rather than simply a deficiency of governance. MacIntyre meditates on the forgotten but vital role of Anglo-Protestant culture in shaping America's identity, values, and governance structures. He argues that the original American political and cultural framework, grounded in this tradition, emphasized individualism, restrained government, free speech, and a strong moral foundation. Ignoring this heritage Modern political discourse often avoids acknowledging the cultural specificity underpinning American political philosophy. He laments that efforts to forcibly transform America into a multicultural, ideologically neutral nation erase the historically organic cultural foundation crucial for Republican self-governance. This disconnect between heritage and present practice destabilizes the social fabric. He warns that multiculturalism, as currently implemented, tends toward cultural homogenization and erasure rather than genuine pluralism rooted in mutual respect for distinct traditions. In examining contemporary social conflict, MacIntyre critiques the legal and political frameworks that declare any outcome differences between racial groups as evidence of systemic racism, regardless of intent or context. He highlights the disparate impact doctrine from civil rights law as a legal foundation that undermines objective policies by criminalizing neutral measures that yield unequal racial results. This, he asserts, creates a narrative where whiteness is continually held responsible and condemned, fueling division and resentment. MacIntyre reveals how government agencies, such as the Community Relations Service, orchestrate narratives to suppress discourse about violence against white victims, effectively prioritizing social control over truth or justice. He argues this racialized weaponization of justice serves to funnel resources and political power to certain constituencies, deepening factional antagonisms and perpetuating what he terms anarcho-tyranny, where certain groups have unchecked license to exercise violence under tacit elite sanction. Despite the grim portrait painted throughout the conversation, MacIntyre spots vital sources of optimism. He emphasizes a growing trend among conservatives and younger generations to prioritize family, community, and tradition over abstract ideology. This shift includes an emerging skepticism within conservative circles about perpetual foreign wars and neoliberal economic policies that harm local communities. Importantly, he notes a religious resurgence among youth who seek meaning and resilience in communal religious practices and intentional communities. These groups, often small and nascent, are forming new social bonds grounded in shared values, providing a foundation for cultural and political renewal. MacIntyre, though rooted in his local community, sees the potential for dispersed, value-driven communities to sustain the American way of life, even amid institutional decay.